I'm a big fan of plushie toys, but I've never tried to make one fully from scratch, so I finally decided to change that by making a rabbit plush. As this is my first time making a plushie toy, I want to make it as simple as possible, so design-wise I made him entirely out of ovals. This way I could get a very simple base down that I could just add onto with little tiny things like horns, wings, and a little face. Another reason why I made him really simple is that I really wanted to use my sewing machine for a lot of this project, because I knew that if I hand sewed the entire thing, I would give up because I would find it really difficult to do. So I just wanted to keep everything really nice and simple. When moving on to actually making the plush, I completely eyeballed all the pieces that I would need based on the design that I just made. This resulted in having 6 separate body parts, each of which is made of 2 layers of fabric. I did end up switching around 2 of the body parts later on, those being the arms and the ears, because I realized that having smaller arms would make the wings more obvious from the front, and I also just couldn't stuff the smaller pieces. I tried so many times to get the stuffing into them, but it just wasn't happening. So that meant that they didn't have the thickness that I wanted for the ears to balance out the legs. As I said before, I wanted to make this as simple as possible, so everything was made out of ovals. However, I do think that if I did this again, I would add little thumbs onto the arms to give the body a tad more detail. Obviously, this would have meant that I had to make some pieces twice because of that swap over, but because I made him really small, I did have quite a lot of fabric left over, so it would have been absolutely fine to use a little bit more fabric for this project. With all my pieces cut out, I then moved on to my sewing portion of this video, starting with the body. This shape was already a little fiddly to sew, and then I realized I hadn't really thought about seam allowance, so I had to sew everything really close to the edge in order to keep the size that I wanted. So it took a lot longer than I expected to sew this particular piece of the plush. However, I think this added difficulty that forced me to take my time with everything actually benefited me in the long run, because the stitching came out so nice and even, and I am quite proud of it. Having very uniform stitching also made this piece much easier to stuff, because I didn't have to put much thought into the way I was stuffing it. If I had made one leg narrower than the other, I would have needed to very consciously decide how much stuffing was needed in each leg in order to balance everything out. But because the legs were the same size and shape, I could kind of just absent-mindedly stuff him until I felt like he was plump enough for my liking. With the base of the body completed, I then moved on to painting on his chest piece and his tail. Rabbits tend to have an extra fluffy top section at the top of their chest, so I wanted to add this into my design to make him look more like a rabbit. I do think I made this part a little bit too big and too smooth, so if I did a rabbit design again, I would definitely make this addition smaller and add some fluffy marks onto it, but I don't hate how it turned out because it does match how I did the face later on, and I also like that it pulls more of the light pink into the design so that the face and the wings don't look too random. For the tail, I just painted a very simple circle with the exact same paint. The paint is 2 parts acrylic to 1 part fabric medium. I didn't add as much fabric medium as I usually would for this project because I'm not planning to ever wash the toy, but I was a little bit worried that if I only went in with acrylic paint, it would peel off over time because it's made of plastic, so adding just a little bit of the fabric medium meant that I could be confident that it wouldn't come off at all. Next, I made the arms. Like I said earlier, I ended up using the smaller pieces for these, and I couldn't stuff them so they are flat, but I think this makes them stand out less in a good way. Arms aren't really a feature part of his design, so it doesn't matter that they don't stand out too much from the body. I initially machine sewed these pieces and then switched to hand sewing to attach them to the body, as I didn't think sewing them onto the body by machine would work very well. This section is just far too close to the edge for my machine to get along with. I do think I need to change the pressure of the foot on my machine because it doesn't like sewing too close to an edge, but it does absolutely fine through things like foam, which makes me believe it's not down tight enough. I do wish I knew more about sewing machines because it would make everything so much easier to fix, but I just don't know what I'm doing with it, so it's kind of just a see as I go, learn as I go, hope that I don't break it kind of thing. Once the arms were done, I then went on to sewing his head. To sew the base, it was the exact same process as my other pieces, so this part was definitely getting quite easy and quick at this point. Once it was all sewn, I then pinned it down onto a piece of card to stop it warping while I painted on the base shape for the face, as it's quite a large portion of the piece, so there is a worry that it will make it curl in on itself. And then I switched to fitting a piece of card inside the head to paint on the face details. When I did this, I did the face twice. I just wasn't feeling my initial design. It was very small and it just didn't have that children's toy vibe that I wanted him to have. So I went back in and made everything a lot bigger and rounder to make his features more obvious and friendlier. This second paint job was also more reminiscent of my initial design, which I always like. When my end piece ends up vastly different from my initial idea, I always feel a little bit disappointed because it tells me I didn't flesh out my idea enough before jumping straight into making it. And while on a smaller project like this, it doesn't really matter. If that happened during a larger project, I end up wasting so much more time and materials. The only thing really different about the face in my design was that I originally was thinking of doing buttons instead of sewing on his eyes, as this is generally how toys like this are made. But I had already decided not to use buttons by the time I got to this point in the project because I just don't have any tiny black buttons in my current sewing collection, and I don't want to buy anything new for this particular project. I say that in a lot of my videos, but I really do stand my ground on not mindlessly purchasing new materials when I have perfectly good materials like, for example, black paint that is ready to go and I can use straight away. Once the face was dry, I then added the stuffing to his head and sewed him directly onto the body. I was a little bit more careful on how I stuffed his head because I didn't want the stuffing to warp the face paint or make his head too puffy so that it wouldn't sit on the body correctly. I wanted this plush to be quite flat because it goes better with how I chose to make it, and I also like flatter toys when they're standing on two legs as they stand up a lot better on a shelf than a plushier one. The final sewed feature on the rabbit was his ears. These were made once again by sewing around the edge of the shape, flipping the fabric around and stuffing them before hand sewing them onto the sides of the rabbit's head. This really transformed his look. I felt like he looked more like a seal before, but as soon as I added those ears, he really did look like a rabbit. Finally, I wanted to add wings and horns to his design, which I made using interfacing. I bought a big sheet of interfacing for a bag project I did, and since then I have used it for 4 projects and it's still going strong, despite the fact that I only bought a 1 meter long sheet. This is a good example as to why I don't impulse purchase crafting materials, because if I went out and bought everything I wanted, 1, I'd had no money left, and 2, I would have mounds of materials and not enough project ideas to make a dent in them. I would love to have all the time in the world to work on my artistic hobbies, but I just don't, mainly because my job is kind of strange, wherein I get home around 11 PM, and I don't want to be sewing at that time because I live in a flat, and I'm sure my neighbours would not appreciate the noise that my sewing machine makes while they're trying to sleep. Anyway, like I was saying, I would love to have all the time in the world to create art, but it's just not realistic. So if I got into the habit of buying new materials for every project, I would be vastly over-consuming, and I don't want to do that. I didn't talk too much about that process, sorry about that. Basically all I did was cut out the designs I wanted and paint them using a part fabric paint, half acrylic paint, the same sort of mix that I used before. Once those pieces were all dry, which takes a long time with interfacing because it is very porous, it absorbs the paint quite a lot, so you need to do quite a few layers on it. But once it was dry, I then glued them onto my rabbit. Interfacing is a fabric-based material, so I could have very easily sewn them into place, but especially with things like the horns that I wanted to stand upright, I knew that if I sewed them, I would accidentally pull them in one way or the other by tightening my seams too much. So to avoid that, I just went straight for glue. With that said, that is it for the process portion of this video, and I can finally show you the final result. I'm really happy with how he turned out. I feel like he just looks really cute and it is a very me thing. 1, my favourite colour is orange. 2, I like plushy toys. And 3, I like little magical toys. So having wings and antlers really makes it into something that I love. Obviously the construction isn't perfect, especially around the ears and around the neck where I've hand sewed it. You can definitely see my stitches. I think I just need to practice a little bit more on hand stitching and how to do certain stitches where I can hide my seams a little bit better. But other than that, I do think he came out rather adorable. Obviously if you actually try to play with him, like if you gave this to a child, it would not hold up. These would come off way too easily. These would come off very easily. I feel like his ears would probably come off as well. But I'm not personally planning on ever playing with him or giving it to a child because I don't have one of those in my life. So I am just going to put him on a shelf with all my other toys, and I think he's going to look really cute up there. With that said, that is it for this video. If you did enjoy it, please give it a like down below, comment what else you'd like me to do, and subscribe as I post a new video every single week, and I'd love to see you again. But until then, bye!